Considering it was the most popular mainstream period in wrestling history, it should come as no surprise that the Attitude Era created a lot of stars. Hell, back then, even mid-card acts like Venis and the Godfather had a lot of non-wrestling fans knowing who they were. But that doesn't mean everyone was a star at the turn of the millennium. No, there were still a few who managed to slip through the cracks into obscurity. But just who are the most forgotten wrestlers from the Attitude Era? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with Salvatore Sincere. Who was Salvatore Sincere? Well, he was a supposed mafioso character that first debuted in WWF in 1996, with him being just one of many wrestlers with jobs gimmicks which existed at the time. Unlike some others, such as TL Hopper and The Goon, though, by the time the Attitude Era rolled around, Sincere would still be there doing his thing as only he could. No, he was never a main event guy or anything. In fact, the most the Philadelphia native ever got out of the rest of his run in 1997 and the early months of 1998 was the occasional match on Raw. And whenever he was appearing there, he was almost always doing the job to bigger stars like Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, and a young Rocky Maivia. But he most certainly was there for at least the beginnings of the second great boom period in WWF. So why has he since gone so forgotten then? Well, probably because his gimmick was by then such a relic of the past. That's right, by the time 1998 rolled around, few fans wanted any of that new generation era goofiness anymore. Rather, what they wanted were more serious adult-themed characters like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. And that's why it should come as no surprise that following one last match against Jeff Jarrett on the March 17, 1998 episode of Raw, Salvatore Sincere would find his time in Vince McMahon's employ coming to an end as he instead returned to the indie circuit and there ran out the clock on what remained of his career. Could he have been more? Sure, if he had a different version of the character. Unfortunately though, this version of Salvatore Sincere was always going to have a ceiling. And the same thing could be said about our next subject too, another forgotten star of the Attitude Era who went by the name of Scott Putski. Of course, in Scott Putski's case, he really should have been a lot better remembered, if for no other reason than his father was WWF legend Ivan Putski. So with a great pedigree behind him then, and an in with management before he ever set foot inside of a WWF ring, there should have been nothing stopping this Austin native from becoming a big star. Except that's not what happened with him. No, instead of becoming a top guy during the Attitude Era, Putski quickly slid into irrelevance as almost immediately after he started, everyone forgot he was there. What happened here? Well, the long and short answer is that he was miscast in the role as a light heavyweight star. And the reason he was so miscast as a light heavyweight star was because he weighed 260 pounds. That's right, even by the standards of huge wrestlers at the time, asking fans to believe that someone this size was small was asking a lot. So understandably then, the audience quickly rejected the idea of the second generation star battling it out over the light heavyweight title with Brian Christopher once he debuted in WWF in May of 1997. Would Vince McMahon realize this mistake they'd made and just repackage Putski as more of a heavyweight star? Someone who could be put in the ring with other top guys like Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels? Not quite. Instead, he'd continue trying to fit a square peg into a round hole for the rest of the summer, and when that ultimately did nothing to get the rookie over, he'd hand in his notice to leave the company, with him eventually going in September and never returning again. Thankfully for Scott Putski though, back then there was another option if you wanted to get work with a major wrestling company in North America, and that option was WCW. So for the next couple of years, he could be found working down in Atlanta instead. But as for his time in WWF, well, that would be done for good. And it was also around this time that our next subject was also finding his time in WWF coming to an end forever. Yes, it's time to talk about Key. Yes, many fans may be wondering who the heck was Key. After all, even for people who were fans of wrestling during the Attitude Era, this one might be hard to recall. But Key most certainly did exist, and he was part of the WWF roster during 1999, right as the company was in the middle of its second boom period. Of course, the reason many fans may not remember him is because back then he wasn't given much focus. No, even in the stable of mid-carders that the Sacramento native was a part of, he was very much third tier. What was this stable? Well, it was one which included Draws and Prince Albert, and with both those men being people who were partial to the odd narcotic or two, it only made sense that they'd have their own personal dealer come down to the ring with them. So it was Key, or To give him his real name, Vic Grimes, who was cast in the role of this dealer, with him using his connections to help his stablemates always get what they needed prior to a bout. And during the few times he was required to hit the ring, he'd be able to do that too, though not for very long, as after having issues with people backstage, he would be cut from his contract only a few months into it. What did he do after this? Well, like many misfit wrestlers during the 90s, he went to ECW where he had one of the most infamous matches of all time. The bout where he faced off against New Jack in a scaffold match, and New Jack, by his own admission, tried to permanently end Grimes by throwing him off it at the end. But what about our next forgotten subject? That being Just Joe. Who was Just Joe? Well, he was just Joe. That was it. That was all we knew about him. Is it a surprise this one never took off then? Not really, as in terms of forgettable gimmicks, this one has to be near the top of the all-timer list. But before he joined WWF, Just Joe was an indie stalwart from Toronto who, in the 90s, came up alongside the likes of Edge and Christian. Unlike his peers though, Joe had never really gotten his big break with either WWF or WCW. That was until 2000. Yes, it was at this point the Canadian finally got the call from one of the big two. And luckily for him, with this being 2000, that call didn't come from WCW. No, instead it came from WWF, and they wanted him to report there with immediate effect so he could start playing the new role of Just Joe. A guy who, like with Prince and Madonna, liked to go by only one name. Unlike them though, Just Joe also had a habit of stirring the pot wherever he went by spreading rumors and stories about his fellow performers on screen. Not that this got him anywhere in the end, however, as despite the gimmick being used during the summer of 2000, it never really connected with fans in any meaningful way. And so that was why, pretty quickly, Joe would be relegated to taking part in nothing segments and matches where he competed against the likes of Joey Abs and the Brooklyn Brawler. And once that ran its course, he'd be cut from his contract altogether in March of 2001, with this technically meaning he made it to the end of the Attitude Era. That said, Just Joe is not going to be appearing in an Attitude Era retrospective anytime soon, as there just wasn't enough here for him to be remembered either fondly or unfondly. And it's this lack of having anything to grab onto which also spelled doom for our next subject when he spent a brief time working for the WWF in 1998 as Brackus. Now on the face of things, Brackus should have been an easy win for Vince McMahon, as here was a guy who had everything the boss was looking for in a star performer. After all, he certainly had the look, and a lot of potential to mold into a star. Unfortunately though, in Brackus's case, this wasn't enough to get him over, as by the point he joined WWF in March of 1998, he was having to compete with the likes of Steve Austin and Mick Foley for airtime, people who had a far greater connection with fans. And this booking certainly didn't help with his claim to have a spot at the top of the card either, because rather than be treated like a killer straight out of the gate, Hakeem Elbrecht would instead be chained to the mid-card as he did early jobs for the likes of Jeff Jarrett and the artist formerly known as Goldust. Then, as if that weren't bad enough, things would get even worse once the summer of 1998 rolled around, as at this point, Brackus would be tasked with taking part in the infamous Brawl for All, a shoot-fighting tournament that no one came out of looking good. And if rumors are to be believed, the German didn't even know he was taking part in a shoot-fighting competition here until he stepped in the ring for the first bout with Savio Vega and realized his opponent was legitimately trying to beat him up. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that Brackus would get eliminated in the first round of this tournament. And after that was over, he'd return to doing jobs for mid-card acts all the way until July, at which point he was cut from his contract. What went wrong with him? Honestly, we're not sure, as it doesn't even seem like his bosses gave him a chance to succeed. But let's move away from the men for a moment, as it isn't just them who represent the forgotten stars of the Attitude Era. No, there were also plenty of women who fit that bill too, and one of the most notable of these would be our next subject, Barbara Bush. No, we're not talking about the former First Lady of the United States here, rather, we're talking about Kathy Dingman, the woman who worked for WWF for a brief period in 1999 under the name of BB, or Barbara Bush. Yes, after making her debut as a paramedic on the 1999 Thanksgiving episode of SmackDown, where she performed the Heimlich maneuver on the cat following her gravy bowl match, it wasn't long before this young rookie was getting ready to hit the ring herself, with her almost immediately entering the orbit of the WWF's women's title as she started a program with Ivory. And this all left Jerry Lawler very excited on commentary as the pair began fighting it out in matches such as bikini contests, wet t-shirt contests, and a holiday topless top rope match. What became of BB after this feud was over? Well, she'd be released when it came to light that she and Bob Holly were having a relationship behind the scenes. So, like that, the time of Barbara Bush in WWF came to an end, not with a bang, but with a whimper, and her run would be very quickly resigned to the forgotten isle of history. But BB isn't the only woman of the Attitude Era who suffered this fate, as the same thing happened to our next subject too. Who are we talking about here? Why, Nicole Bass, of course. That said, in the case of Nicole Bass, she wouldn't be placed in the role of stereotypical diva of the time. Rather, it was her unconventional looks that made her stand out, as looking about as far as you could from the traditional swimsuit model the company liked to employ at that time, she certainly was unique. But then her bodybuilder physique had already made her stand out prior to her time in WWF, when she was popping up in places like Extreme Championship Wrestling or The Howard Stern Show, so it really should have been a given that the same thing would happen for her under Vince McMahon's employ. Unfortunately for her though, none of this translated towards a successful run for the Queen's native. As while she was certainly eye-catching, going in the ring was never her forte. No, whenever she was tasked to take part in a match, usually one which involved her teaming up with her on-screen love interest for a while, Venis, the limited skills she had there were very quickly seen by audiences. Sure, this didn't have to be a killing blow for Bass, especially not during the Attitude Era when in-ring skills weren't as highly prized. But sadly for her, she didn't have the best promo skills either. And so it was that after only appearing on Raw for a few months in 1999, she'd disappear from the WWF entirely in July of that year and would never return to the ring again, aside from a few appearances at indie shows in the immediate years following, that was. But what about our next subject? Someone who also stood out in a big way when he debuted with the Fed in 1998 on account of his physical presence, Giant Silva. Yes, WWE have long been fans of bringing in big men to serve as imposing figures for either baby faces or heels to fight. It's been the case as far back as the time of Vince McMahon Sr. and his frequent usage of Andre the Giant. But with these big men often comes the double-edged sword of them not being able to actually wrestle, usually on account of their sheer size, making it hard for them to move around. Sure, Andre the Giant was great and all, and people like The Undertaker, Kane, or The Big Show have been excellent at various points in their career, but for every one of those, we've been subjected to a Great Khali or a Giant Gonzalez. And it's in that latter category which Giant Silva falls. Not that WWF were unaware of this back during the late 90s, of course. No, they were all too aware that the Sao Paulo native was never going to be a main eventer. And so that was why, rather than trying to force it, they instead decided to use him in a more comedic role, more specifically as a member of the Oddities. But while this did give him a role on the show as a tag team partner for the likes of Golga, Kurrgan, and the Insane Clown Posse, because again, the 90s, it meant he'd never do anything memorable during his time on Raw. Yes, there's an argument to be made that despite his mammoth size certainly allowing him to pass the airport test, the most memorable thing Giant Silva did in WWF was take part in a 3-on-4 handicap match at SummerSlam 1998 when he and his two other larger-than-life teammates made short work of Kaientai. Outside of that, we really struggled to think of anything he did of note, and this has meant that in the years since, his contributions to the Attitude Era have largely gone forgotten in favor of the work of bigger stars. And so, it's not surprising that few fans remember him today, as it wasn't like he was some great hidden gem or anything. When it comes to other since-forgotten members of the Attitude Era, however, they most certainly can be considered hidden gems. And one of the people this statement applies to the most is our next subject, Aguila. Who was Aguila? Well, he was a luchador from Guadalajara, Mexico, who first appeared on WWF television back in November of 1997 as part of their then newly created light heavyweight division. But while Aguila was certainly a better fit for this division than someone like Scott Putski, that didn't mean fans took to him in a major way, as by then WWE audiences has still largely been conditioned to see smaller, more high-flying guys as secondary to the real stars. Though while he could certainly put on an impressive match, one complete with all of the kinds of acrobatics you'd expect to see today in a Rey Mysterio or Ricochet bout back in 1997, Aguila just kind of floundered, and it didn't even help when he periodically changed up his name either. No, whether he was going by the name of Aguila, Papi Chulo, or S.A. Rios, the Mexican native was never really able to break out, and so he was never really able to make any lasting memories in fans' minds. In fact, you could argue that of all the things he did do in WWF between his debut and eventual exit in 2001, the most memorable was introducing someone else to the Fed, as it was while working under the name S.A. Rios in 2000 that he began being accompanied down to the ring by Lita. And as we all know now, Lita would quickly turn into one of the biggest women's stars the WWF had ever seen, as she left her initial man behind and instead moved on to becoming the third member of Team Extreme. That said, for as good as this worked out for Amy Dumas, it did little to help Aguila, as today, all it's turned him into is a trivia note. And considering he was actually a really good wrestler with a lot to offer, that's something of a crime. But then with the roster back then being so absolutely stacked, especially by the time 2000 came around and the likes of Kurt Angle, Chris Jericho, and Eddie Guerrero were there, maybe such things were always going to be inevitable. And it's not just singles acts who fell into this forgotten hole either, because with the Attitude Era being one of the few times WWE had some really great tag team wrestling, it meant there were also some duos which got forgotten in favor of the Dudleys, the Hardys, or Edge and Christian. And of those duos, perhaps the most notable of all is the CanAm Express. Who were the CanAm Express? Well, they were a team made of Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon, one that first made their name in places like All Japan Pro Wrestling and ECW during the early 90s. Hell, so much of an impact would they make there, by the time the mid-90s rolled around, they have become 5-time All-Asia Tag Team Champions. And as if that wasn't enough, Phil LaFon would even find some singles success out east as a 2-time World Junior Heavyweight Champion too. So you'd think that when they joined WWF in late 1996 then, they'd be a shoo-in for winning some gold quickly. But unfortunately, this didn't happen because as 1996 gave way to 1997 and the early days of the Attitude Era began to take hold, Furnas and LaFon found that they just couldn't replicate the same levels of success they'd found elsewhere. Why was this? Well, it was most likely because they arrived a little bit too early. Yes, while WWF's tag team division was booming come 2000, what with this being around the point the TLC series was starting to reintroduce fans of the WWF to the idea that tag team wrestling could be great, back in 1997, things were not on this level quite yet. So because of that, rather than be able to work with duos like the Dudleys or the Hardys, the CanAm Express instead had to settle for pretty go-nowhere feuds against opponents such as the Godwins and the New Rockers. Hell, even when they got something decent to sink their teeth into in the form of a program with the Legion of Doom, it still led to nothing, as this was Hawk and Animal in 1997, not Hawk and Animal at the height of their powers back in the 80s. And as if that weren't enough, after both men were involved in a car accident in the summer of that year, both Furnas and LaFon would be forced to miss months of action, hampering their momentum even more, and meaning that upon getting cleared again, Vince McMahon would find that he had nothing for them anymore. Yes, it was at this point the duo went over to ECW as part of a talent exchange in late 1997, and that's where the pair would spend the rest of their time under contract with the WWF. Sure, it wasn't all bad, as they would get to win the ECW tag team titles while there, but this was only a small solace for them, as by this point, they were being forced to watch what was happening with the tag team division in WWF in their absence. Yes, it must have been a bitter pill to swallow, but as we've seen today, Furnas and LaFon aren't alone in being forgotten stars of the Attitude Era. No, there are plenty of them, and while they may not have been game changers, they still deserve to be better remembered for helping to make that era as special as it was.